Welcome to Epic Inspire. Today we're going to discuss the general issue of platforming or deplatforming. To platform or not to platform? To deplatform or not to deplatform? and just to give a little bit of a context, there's lots of different ways this can show up, not just in the psychedelic space, but other places. I mean, I know there's been a lot of conversation around, for example, Chopra and the Epstein files and other people who have been named, but it's also shown up in particular in the psychedelic space for people who have either been accused of harm or have been actually even legally documented and even had their medical license suspended for a year, for example, with Cessa, a public case, or Francoise Aharon, involving the public statement that Will made on Mad in America, or other accusations that we can name. But it's an ongoing issue, and once one of these things comes up, there may be the sort of official professional response, like Cessa for being literally having a an effect for his medical license. But then there's the question of like conferences or recordings and trainings that have already occurred. Do you remove those trainings? Do you remove those workshops? Do you no longer have that person on? What should the standard be? And at what point do we decide what's the basis that I mean, I think the positive way of putting it is like when should someone even be allowed to be platformed? Are there questions we should be asking everyone consistently on whether or not they should be able to, or like, I mean, you could call that gatekeeping, which is like the negative way of putting it, but there's also appropriate boundaries, right? Maybe if you are a legally documented sex offender, that maybe that would be a legitimate basis for not having them on a platform. And then on the other side, the deplatforming, it's, if or if there's documented, it's public, right? That would become a basis for revisiting any sort of ways you've uplifted them on your platforms, or whether you invite them, or if they're literally scheduled to speak tomorrow, or even sort of personal ethics things where I know for me there's some things I don't go to because of their choices about what they platform or what they don't platform, or how they've dealt with ethical issues. So, with that as our setup, Sam, what are some of your initial thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree, this is really current. People, if anyone following along from Australia will know just how current that has been here. Not so much, well, both within psychedelics, but also in general. People are. It's a more common tactic here for uh, political disagreements than I would like. Uh, to deplatform people. Maybe I'm biased in that I don't agree with everyone who's been deplatformed, but it is certainly a thing that is current here. It happens. Um, it's yeah. So it's an important question, not just for psychedelics, but for anywhere where people are speaking. In Australia, in particular, at writers' festivals, it's particularly a thing. Who gets to speak and who doesn't? Uh, I think one of the reasons why this has been kind of controversial and contentious is, I think, as you alluded to, is not having clear standards on who gets, on around this, not having some measure that, and we've seen situations here where people are being, you end up, people are being excluded or included on the basis of, I guess, opinions or
Political views.
political views. The board of directors of an organisation will go and discuss it, and do we keep them in or keep them out? Because and then oftentimes for very high profile cases, there's political pressure gets applied. We've had cases here
Or
where
financial pressure,
yeah,
lots
yeah,
of
yeah,
different,
yeah, yeah. Lots of sponsors threaten to pull out, which there's
that's
not
right.
much you can necessarily do about that. But also what's been more common here, it has been political intervention, not just political pressure, but political intervention, and direct contact between high-ranking politicians and the board of directors of writers' festivals, saying I don't think you should let this person speak. Uh, so it's and part of what uh, enables this pressure to be applied, in my opinion, is having is a relative lack of a a measure or of a standard, that you can say that you've applied, and um, I mean, people are going to try anyway, but in the absence, that makes it just that much easier um, for this to happen. But also means that you put more pressure. Like, there's nothing good about it, I think, because you then end up with it's more pressure on decision makers to um, kind of you have to having to think through every time whether or not
Yeah, and that's
you do this.
and we're saying like one of the reasons why you come up with agreements or you come up with standards is so that you've had the discussion and you've determined for your community, for your group, for your organization, what that standard is going to be, right? And that then it's actually even creates less bias, and allows for a more consistent standard to be applied than trying to evaluate on a case by case basis. I know we haven't talked too much about casuistry, or like or what if you do things case by case, what are some of the issues with that versus applying a standard? And it is a choice. Like, I think for a lot of people, a lot of organizations, small, like, you just have your own little Instagram, and your platform is just whether you have them on your Instagram live, right? It's probably just going to be you making the call, right? And you may not come up with a standard, but it would still help you out if you had one,
Well, this is the
right?
thing, and this is what a good, like any standards, whether it's a particular kind of around a particular activity, or whether it's something like ethical guidelines or ethical codes of practice, but particularly codes of ethics. Uh, Ideally, like, they help you make the decision, and they can't cover everything, they can never cover every eventuality, but they help. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, and you're bound by some, you're not just trying to be bound by precedent. You have something that you can look at and you go, well, this is, how does this standard apply? And of course, you revisit the standard when you need to, but it is ideally that's what these codes should do. These things should help you make the decision,
That's right.
and at least some of the time, there's always going to be cases where you have to get everyone
There's
together and think
always
about it.
outliers. and
Always
and maybe
outliers.
that's part of it, is like people don't understand, like, look, standards are always going to have outliers, and that's because the standards aren't making the decision. The
You are.
standards are applied to decision making, right? And also to communicate decision making.
Yeah, and
Right?
this
So
is the
like,
basics of like having an organization. This is why you end up with so much paperwork behind the scenes and so many governing documents behind the scenes. These are our
right,
standards. This is our procedure for what happens when the standards don't work. What do we do when what do we do when our board or our committee doesn't agree? Like, this is why you have procedures, is so that there is some structure for these things, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and so there's more than just you know people arguing over stuff. So it's not going to work every time, but if you have somewhere to start from and you've thought about it, this is also, again, this is why we do things like professional ethics for professions at university. It's not just a sort of a ticker box thing. It's so that when difficulties inevitably arise in the real world, people have had exposure and have some ways to think about them, so then they're not just completely at sea the first time something happens and it's not a clear yes or no. But either way, the good thing about some guidelines, it might just be that instantly gives you some yes or no sort of options that cover 80% of the questions, um, and that's
yeah.
80% less wrangling over something that you have to do.
Especially if it's something that comes up a lot. I think that would be one thing I would say, like, if this is coming up a lot, or the issue is really important to you, or you want to make a clearer stance on these sort of issues around platforming and deplatforming. Like, let's say you want to take a very clear stance on not platforming anyone who has a history of sexual assault,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Let's just say documented, legal, public cases, and I realize that that leaves open a whole wide range of things about, like, well, what if the woman just states something, or the male just states something as happening, or whoever the person is making the accusation. What if it's something just hearsay? Well, then you're going to have to decide, is that sufficient to be able to deplatform someone? But I will say, in general, at the very least, even if you're not sure in those cases, there should be some places where it's a clear case, right? Like, there's no question. The person's admitted to it. And I'm not trying to pick on Sessa in any way, shape, or form, but
It's
it's a
okay.
nice example. It's a nice example because, he, a medical professional, a documented case, right? Um, Went through a process, and he admitted to his involvement, right? So it wasn't a question, like, he's not questioning the main facts. The his profession wasn't questioning the main facts, right? And that's all public record. Okay, so, like, all documented, all things, like, this should be the easiest case for anyone, right? The person's not arguing against it. The records aren't arguing against it. It's documented. It even has a profession behind it. All the things. Uh, then what would be your standard? Would you still, like, maybe you'd allow them in a situation where they're discussing what happened, right? Maybe that would
And
make sense.
I think it's contextual too. Like
Yeah, that's the
there are
context
some
part,
places
right?
where it might be appropriate for him to speak. There might be some
Right.
places where it's, and it could be, and I think these places exist. I think, uh, and I think the context, the places or the contexts exist where it might be appropriate for to seek his opinion, or for him to be able to give his opinion. Uh, but,
But
uh, but,
we're trying
not
to be
all of them.
charitable here, everyone.
But trying to be charitable here, but not all of them, and not everywhere. Yeah, I think it's unless it's. I think it's the. I mean, in Cessa's case, I think uh, the places where I would be comfortable with him being platformed are the exception, not the rule.
That's
If you
right.
know what I mean. I think
Yeah,
that's and I would say that for anyone in his position. Like
that's right. It's not
I
just
am,
on him.
if anyone, if any psychiatrist, psychologist, facilitator, um, has that level of public, kind of evidence for what they did, I am really perfectly comfortable with saying I won't go to that conference that they're speaking at. I
That's
won't
right.
buy the book. I won't attend the webinar, um, and I will absolutely judge you for platforming them if it's outside of a relatively limited number of contexts. And I'd feel pretty justified in doing so. And if people don't
Yeah,
like that,
because
that's
it's a
too
pretty
bad.
public knowledge too. Because, like, there's a,
Yeah,
like, sometimes, like, people will be like, "Well, I didn't know," right? I'm like, okay,
yeah,
there's a span of that, and you can educate and inform people. Like, well, here's some of the articles. Let me help inform you.
yeah, yeah.
But
I
this is a
didn't, I
very
didn't,
public case. Like, that was very well documented.
yeah, I didn't know is a thing that you can get away with as an audience member. Maybe I didn't know isn't a thing
Maybe, but
maybe
not as a
it's
conference.
you're not properly discharging your ethical obligations as a conference organizer, for example. If you did that, and in Sessa's case, as far as I'm aware, not that I check up on him or where he appears, because I just don't care. I As far as I know, like most organisations I'm aware of, have actually taken quite a strong line with that, and you know, um, that's been some of them quicker than others. Some organisations, to be fair, did drag it out until after his sort of determination of the medical board. Um, uh, some people dropped him quicker than others, but yeah, most organisations, in fact, all organisations that I'm aware of, did eventually get on board with this, and have said that, basically more or less said that, been pretty consistent. There's a general consensus that him appearing is going to be the exception rather than the rule now, um, within psychedelic organisations. Uh, and I think, when you do that, there can be, some wiggle room in that. I think it's depending on the nature of the accusation or what's happening, I don't think it's entirely unfair to do it before, the medical board or the trial has finished.
Yeah.
Um,
And for
and
the record, like he's no longer on, on suspension
Well, no, that's
anymore.
right.
He's
He
allowed
gets to. He is. I am not aware of what he's currently doing, but he is able to practice again, probably with some restrictions. But he has done his time. Uh, you
in
know,
terms of the profession is
in
concerned.
terms
Yeah.
of the profession, he has done his time. But this also, like we get to be discerning. We don't have to. We don't
That's right.
we don't have to. Not everyone gets to speak, and we can kind of get into. I don't seriously entertain that not being platformed is a infringement on your sort of rights around free speech or freedom of political or ideological communication or anything like that.
Well,
Um,
but then there's the reverse case, and now this is what you're making me think of. Is like cases where people are not platformed that maybe deserve to be heard, right? That are not platformed based on discretion, right? Which I'm thinking of. For example, I know that there was a very public documented protest that happened during not the most recent one, but the previous Map Science, where one of the indigenous groups that was there and planned on speaking ended up protesting and speaking and was given a voice by Rick on stage at the end, but but it was because they felt that they weren't being properly, in part, and I can't speak for them, but they weren't being properly platformed, and that in some sense they had been deplatformed because of changes that were made in terms of what the talk could be about, who could be on the panel, and things like that, effectively deplatforming a conversation that they felt that they had a right to participate in and were no longer being given a voice and being silenced, right? um, and I think it's important for us to bring up both aspects of this conversation, that it's not just about who should not be allowed to speak anymore because of actual documented harm or alleged harm, uh, or even historical harm having to do with a totally different space and a totally different practice that may be relevant to whether or not, like, think about Chopra with the Epstein files, right? Now he's being deplatformed. I would argue appropriately. uh, but then there's other cases where uh, you don't actually get to see the basis for why some people are given a stage and a platform and why other people aren't. There's a sort of assumption sometimes that's like it's political, it's financial, it's because they were best buddies with so and so, or they can't control what someone is going to say and they don't want to look bad or disfavorable, so they're not going to have the conversation, or they end up cutting the time for something, and
yeah,
then, right, like all sorts of moves that are made to effectively silence certain conversations, and this happens across the board. But I think because that does happen and that isn't transparent, that process most of the time is not transparent. And similarly, it's often not transparent the basis for platforming or deplatforming someone. And I think if we make a general effort to be more clear about our standards, about when we do or do not, I think it would help the overall space in psychedelics and beyond, to be able to improve, and work in greater integrity and alignment, and foster better relationships, because it ends up, like, I mean, I've even asked myself this question in terms of the Inner Source podcast, right? I think there's an assumption that if I have someone on that conversation, that they're going to be, that I'm vouching for them, right? So, and I'm not saying that in general. I think I do pick people who I feel but it doesn't mean I agree with everything that they say or that I'm saying that, it's appropriate to platform them. But I'm asking myself this question. It's like, okay, at what point would I pull something, or even if I record a podcast and they say some things that I think are inappropriate, when do I decide that that's not appropriate to show, right? To never, right? I mean, it's, you know, but I'm saying, like, I'm just gonna say, I'm just gonna argue that we should all have standards, even if it's just cursory and writing a note to ourselves. But I think it's best if we can not just come up with these standards, but also communicate these standards, create more conversations around it, and and I think that will improve the decision making, not just around when we do platform and when we don't platform, but also help, survivors, help these sort of tensions in the space, and also help us to take quicker and decisive action and not hesitate.
Yeah, I think being transparent and decisive is definitely an advantage here. It's a benefit to everyone. I think uh, ideally, some people who maybe get to take up less time and space for good reasons. Ideally that would open up more space, more an opportunity for other people to have some
That's
time
right.
and space who may have missed out otherwise. For different sort of complex and often structural reasons. That's how it should be. It's not really necessarily how it works, but I think having standards, having things to think about, and it's difficult because and the more controversial in some ways that there is a particular kind of ways that things are controversial that is difficult, and you have to kind of make a call on whether trying to make a call, like thinking about is something going to do more harm than good, and what is important here about platforming or not platforming someone, and like thinking about who I think that had been a thing, and that just in thinking about sort of communities, this was a conversation that I had over a year ago now, but um, thinking about with people in my community that I know, and it come up a lot. It's like, well, when at the big stage at the conference, at the keynote, who gets to be the keynote speakers at things, not just from kind of a
Yeah.
negative, who should we keep out, but who should be there, who gets to, it's bigger than just this person did this thing, so we don't let them talk. It's who speaks for us, who
Yeah, and this gets into a
who's
bigger
a
conversation:
bigger
who's
question.
representative, or
Totally,
who's
totally.
or who's
Yeah.
innovative, or who's
Well, our conversation was around, like, when you have events that have arisen out of grassroots communities. Does the grassroots of the do the grassroots of the community, you know, do they feel represented by
yeah.
keynote speakers? Are the keynote
Well, and I would say on the whole,
speakers
the answer is no,
on
but
and the answer on the whole, and that was a lot of people felt that way, and people have stopped attending events because they feel that way,
sensitive.
because
Yeah.
it's things that have grown out of community events. The headliners are representative of the rich and famous, international authors of
The
best-selling,
influencer
psychedelic books.
version, right?
The academic and intellectual elite of the field, rather than, which is not necessarily, it's not that people don't want to hear what they have to say and that they don't respect them, but this does not exhaust the possibilities of who the community wants to hear from, and who the community feels represents them and speaks for them, and
Well,
who has the most respect in the community necessarily. So
and this gets into, like, what are the standards,
mm,
right? Like, is the standard based on, what represents the community's interest, or what they think is important or significant or an essential issue or a voice, or is it about who's going to sell the most tickets so that the conference can actually happen, because they need to be able to raise funds in order to make the conference happen, right? Type of thing. Like, there are competing interests. Like, a lot
yes,
of our conversations, there's always competing interests, there's always competing values, right? And I think at the end of the day, just like you were saying, like if grassroots people feel like they're not being represented, then you don't go, right? Or if you really feel like um, an issue that you feel needs to be platformed or discussed or addressed in a particular way and is not, then vote with your finances. I'm often surprised at how many people will go to conferences hosted by people who are known to cause harm in the space, well documented. Even the leaders of the organization and people will acknowledge that, yeah, I do this, right? And then people will go to the conference, and I'm like, because it's a good way to get together or to
Hmm.
hang out,
Everyone
right?
else is
It's not
going.
right. Everyone else is going, or that like it's, and I'm like, well, then maybe we need to appreciate the fact that the reason why some people go to these conferences has nothing to do with the people, has everything to do with the community aspect. And yet it's not community centered a lot of times, and it's not, and we're not often choosing to go to conferences based on our standards. But that's just me. I mean, maybe I don't want to sound like I'm complaining, but I do get on my high horse quite a bit. But but I mean, at least for me, at least speaking for myself, like I tend to go to not very many conferences. I tend not to speak at very many conferences. I haven't even tried to apply to very many conferences, right? I'm not
Yeah,
even trying to go anymore. And there's multiple reasons for that. But I will tell you that there are definitely ones that I'm not going to for ethical reasons,
yeah, yeah.
and
Same.
you cannot convince me to go.
But yeah, look. It's I don't go to a lot of conferences, so it's less. I think it's been less of an issue directly for me. But again, like it's a thing I wanted to bring up because it's like this is something that people have talked to me about. This is a concern that people
Yeah.
have talked to me about. So again, like it's like people have told you this. People I respect have told me this. So I'm like, well, it's worth. You have to walk the walk and throw it out there.
Walk the walk. Like that's my thing. Like just walk the walk. Lots of people are talking. And I think also the other good thing about the standards piece for platforming or deplatforming is that it stops like the sort of cancel culture dog pile that can happen sometimes. That's that often ends up being based on purely word of mouth that isn't based on any facts whatsoever. Um, you know, that can often be a he said, she said, or they said type of situation, and I think we should be very careful of that as well. That that we should have a a justified or reasonable justification for whether we platform or deplatform someone. We should increase our transparency, and that goes for me included. So I will at least commit to figuring out what my standard is more officially for at least my little podcast. And if we ever have guests on here, if we ever decide to go that way, we'll have to come up with a standard too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we talked about this, Sam. And if you have any comments, thoughts, share, hype, all the things. We're planning on trying to maybe eventually switch to lives on this. But for now, you just get us talking to each other. So if you start talking, we'll start talking more too. Anyway, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Dink.